is titled Shifting Perspectives from Individual to the Community and Beyond. We'll start off with John Adams. John Adams is a PhD student at McGill University as part of the Economic for the Anthropocene program.
All right. So I'm going to be talking about ideologically motivated reasoning, science, skepticism, and social safety. Upton Sinclair, the famous muckraker of the Gilded Age, about 100 years ago, said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." But salary is not alone in this respect. We regularly rationalize, justify, and otherwise employ our cognitive faculties toward all manner of goals other than accuracy or accurately depicting reality. So this is often called motivated reasoning. I'm going to be focusing on ideologically motivated reasoning, looking at particularly the ideology of the free market in the context of climate change denial in the Anglo world, particularly the US. Ideology is a potent example of what can skew our cognition because we easily become identified with it. And crucially, this happens in a social context. All too often, ideology, or shared ideology, is our ticket to community, to group membership, to belonging, which for the human animal is closely linked to survival. So just a quick overview. I'm going to give a bit of a lens from social neuroscience on belonging, and that's going to inform dynamics, are looking at the dynamics of motivated reasoning, which will come next, and we'll finish up with some directions toward the ecozoic from out of this tangle. In his book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body and the Healing of Trauma, Bessel van der Kolk says, "Our culture teaches us to focus on personal uniqueness, but at a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Our brains are built to help us function as members of a tribe." So if you're here for Josh's, this is going to sound familiar. He goes on to say, "Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health." Social neuroscientist John Cacioppo, in his book Loneliness, Human Nature and the Need for Social Connection, compiles decades of research on social neuroscience and the impacts of social isolation. And on top of it being bad for our health and numerous other impacts, it decreases empathy and it increases threat orientation. That is our orientation to threat in the social environment, and increases our tendency to conform. Van der Kolk and Cacioppo agree that quantity of social connections is not what matters, but it's quality, really being truly seen and heard by the people that we care about is what matters. So a US context, briefly, as compared with 1985 and 2005, people were 3 times as likely to have no close friends and confidants. Loneliness is on the rise. There's been a steep decline in participation in community life over the last half of the 20th century, as laid out by Robert Putnam. And in a similar context in UK, loneliness has been recognized as a public health issue. So looking at ideology and belonging, we can see that much of what appears to be loyalty to ideology is really loyalty to our tribe, to our cultural group. And we'll be seeing some of the evidence of that in a moment. So another thing I'd like us to keep in mind as we move forward is that as long as orthodoxy, as long as believing the right thing is our path to belonging, we won't give that up. We won't chance the ostracizing that is deeply ingrained in our evolution as death, basically. So in that situation, where that's the only thing we've got that gives us a sense of belonging, threats to ideology will be perceived as threats to the self, and our amygdala gets going, our autonomic nervous system prepares us for battle, and others become enemies in the outgroup. So moving on to motivated reasoning itself, some of the data. The point of this slide is just to say on the left there's a common presumption that, oh, people are just dumb, they just are uninformed, they're ignorant, we need to educate them. So the prediction there from that hypothesis shows, okay, regardless of what cultural group you're a part of, it doesn't matter to know what these mean. As people become more literate in science or increase in critical reasoning capacity, there's a number of metrics that this applies for, you'd expect us to converge on the scientific consensus. But in reality, what happens is that according to our, this is the cultural cognition theory, according to our cultural worldviews, the smarter we are, the more capable we are of neutralizing the threats to our ideology, to our group membership. So there's actually increased polarization.
That's not good.
Yeah, yeah, it's a scary picture. It gets worse. So the point here, a key thing to realize is that so free market ideology, I call it free market idealism, is tied to the rejection of science that has regulatory implications, particularly that science. And so if you experimentally tie the free market as the solution to environmental science, for instance, you find that those high in free market ideology become very amenable to that science. Oh, it's great. You can see that relative to people who don't really care, free market, whatever, doesn't make a difference whether it's the solution proposed is government regulation or the free market. Whereas for those who idealize the free market, it matters a lot. So they're solution averse. That's one way to say it. Looking at this slide, I'm guessing that most of the people here through Zoom and in this room would, looking at this guy, MIT professor, Harvard educated, if the quote associated with him were that judged by conventional scientific standards, it is premature to conclude that human CO2 emissions, so-called greenhouse gases, cause global warming. And I asked you, is this scientist an expert? You'd probably say, nah, sounds like a kook. So the same applies for very conservative people. If you give them the high risk scenario there, they'll conclude that he is not an expert. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that the criterion for the validity of evidence is whether it agrees with me. So this has led to some people saying that this is a post-truth era where you can only believe what you already believe. I call it an epistemological crisis. However, there is some evidence that motivated reasoning is constrained. That is, bias away from accuracy is constrained by one's ability to construct seemingly reasonable justifications for one's conclusion. That is, by what you can get away with. And there's some evidence for this. For instance, we've said that the smarter you are, the better able you are to reason seemingly justifiably to the conclusions you want, but it's also harder for you to reject or deny valid reasoning when it's presented. So that's good news. However, motivated reasoning is unconstrained by the heavily funded injection of seemingly reasonable doubt and ideological rhetoric into the public sphere. So these are highly paid, highly funded think tanks putting really clever talking heads onto the media to sow doubt and delay action. This is a divide and conquer strategy that that exaggerates the role of basically orthodoxy in your cultural group. It polarizes and politicizes it and makes it worse. So sorry about that bad news. So taking all that into account, what should we do? So certainly, if we want the ecozoic, constraining reason the best we can is a good idea. So one of the examples from valid reasoning being harder to refute, that earlier graph on general science knowledge doesn't take into account the specific knowledge of, within the context of climate change, the physicochemical mechanism. And there is some evidence that if you show people that, without just referring to scientists agree that, but you say, hey, this is how it works, people become more open to it, even if they were skeptics before. It was just with college students, maybe older people are more stubborn. But anyway, you can do some things maybe, and also call out these merchants of doubt. So if the discussion is really driven by these underlying values, say, of the free market, what's underlying that, maybe fears of the economy being bad and not being able to feed your family. Let's have the discussion at that level and say, okay, what are we really concerned with? Freedom? Let's talk about freedom. And maybe we can find, for instance, through scenario planning, if you've heard of that, some common positive future vision. And then the means toward that are secondary, and we can leverage our common sort of in-group common goal status. But none of that's going to work very well until we can demilitarize conversation, until we can stop making enemies of each other, until, yeah, we can unlearn the argument culture and practice dialogue, working together, connecting as human beings. We can practice curiosity, which is another thing that's correlated with decreased motivated reasoning. So that's a good sign we can practice that as well. But that's going to be made very difficult if we don't nurture a sense of self and nurture community that is independent of ideology, so that there's something to catch us if ideology is threatened, so that ideology being threatened isn't so threatening to us, that we still belong, we still know who we are, we're grounded here together. This is no easy task, but we're visioning here for the future. So to sum up, instead of trying to manage, educate, or otherwise conquer and convert one another, well, I'll leave it to Aldous Huxley to say, try to be a little kinder.
Right.
Thanks very much.
Okay, keep your mic and speakers on. Can you
Gotcha.
keep your speakers on?
Yep.
Okay.
I believe so.
So Nina is moderating the questions for us.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Very inspiring. So,
I can see your eyes, Nina.
oh, okay. Maybe I should
Hit
shut my
your
camera.
your microphone. Turn your mic on, Nina.
It's on. Wait, can you hear me?
We can't hear you. I'll take a question from Josh, though, while you're figuring that out.
So I'm curious if you've seen this research saying that if you rate something down, you're much less likely to change your mind. And if you rate it down publicly, you're much less likely to change your mind. And what the implications are of that in a Facebook world where we all communicate our political views, writing them down publicly.
Well, what comes to mind is the sort of American tradition of like Emerson saying, you know, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. That, you know, if you're consistent, you're basically dead. You may as well concern yourself with your shadow on the wall. But I think perhaps what underlies that is, again, the stigma of being wrong. Okay, and that if we're wrong, we lose space, we lose status, we might be rejected or ostracized. I think underlying that fear is, again, this, what I look at as like deficiency of relationship quality, which has like, I highly recommend the book Loneliness. It documents an incredible array of consequences of this deficiency.
And that's only a partial quote with Emerson. He actually says something that, you know, a consistency over like, I forget what it is, but it's changed the context when you read the whole.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, it's been a while.
All right, Nina, let's see if we can hear you this time.
Okay, how about now?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Great.
Sorry, there's a problem on our end.
Oh,
Wonderful. I'm glad that it's fixed. Thanks so much. There's a question from Malcolm for John. And Malcolm is interested in how do we respond to people who are very militaristic in their conversation?
it's a good question. Yeah. So I think, so I guess I should say, like, I can't expect this of people who are being oppressed or discriminated against to be like the bigger person or whatever. But for those of us who are maybe in the privileged position to not feel threatened on that level, we can maybe practice empathy. We can maybe practice like, it sounds like, you know, like feel into what the underlying concern may be and see if you can, there's a practice I do where the phrase we say is get their world. See if you can come to understand them. And then they're gonna be much more likely to soften and be more receptive to what you have to say. Not that you're trying to change them either. I guess part of this, like not trying to convert and conquer each other is relating to people without the objective of changing them, of fixing them, of being right, but of actually connecting as human beings. So this is yeah, a practice.
So yeah, I think we don't have more questions. Thank you, John. We move on to our next. Oh,
You're good, go ahead.
yeah, we move on to our next presenter, Emma. Emma Spear is a MS student in the Community Development and Applied Economics, and she's also pursuing her certificate in Ecological Economics. Go ahead.
All right, so taking it in a very different direction. John and I had, I think, the least natural pair up, but hopefully this lends to some of the other things that we've talked about today. So the title of my presentation is Tools for Integrating the Ecological Worldview into Policy on the Community Scale. A little bit of background, I came to UVM after a couple of years of political organizing, where we would try to bring about change through strategic and direct action, and we're often working towards a result that kept us confined within a system that we did not have the tools or capacity to upend. And while I enjoyed learning about the principles of the ecological worldview in this course and in my time at UVM, I've been thinking a lot about what it might look like to implement and infuse these ideas into our communities, and to do it right away as kind of a living experiment. So I set out to consider what tools from the world of organizing and public policy and sustainability could be used to answer the following questions. So first, what do we, the ecological economists, the ecological economist activists, want to see at the community level? And I'm using Daly and Cobb's definition of community, which is persons who are internally related to one another, i.e. their relationships define their identities as persons, so that any view of people that treats them as self-contained individuals falsifies the real situation. The second question is, what are the conditions necessary to integrate the ecological worldview? What are the tools we can utilize to facilitate this shift? And then I thought about what it would look like in the Lake Champlain Basin, which is where I direct my research. So my intention wasn't to reinvent the wheel, but instead draw from a variety of disciplines, as is prescribed in ecological economics literature, to provide a stronger context for what a community would have to do to successfully integrate or begin to integrate ideas from the ecological worldview into local policy and programming. And to provide this research with more meaning for myself, I did consider it within the context of the Lake Champlain Basin. So what do we want to see at the community level? The three core components of ecological economics are just distribution, sustainable scale, and efficient allocation. But for the context of this research, I used a few of the tenets that are laid out by Daly and Cobb in their book For the Common Good. I considered the shift from individualism towards person and community, which represents the recognition that well-being of a community as a whole is constitutive of each person's welfare. Sustainable or optimum scale, as it describes the capacity of our community in question. Degrowth or post-growth thinking, and the advocacy of downscaling. And just distribution, which can lead to increased social cohesion and cooperation. So to go about that, I utilized two ways of thinking about how we facilitate change. So first, I thought about Dana Meadows' leverage points, which are places within a system or a community where shifts can yield large-scale change. And keep in mind the goals of some of the tools I outline with my respect to some of the higher level leverage points, which are the goals of the system and the mindset or paradigm of the system. And then I also sought out a well-loved model for making change that I've seen utilized in academia as well as in activism, which is John Cotter's 8-step model for change, which is displayed here. And just to quickly go through the steps, the first is create a sense of urgency, form a guiding coalition, create a vision, communicate the vision, empower others to act on the vision, create quick wins, build on the change, and institutionalize the change. And we can take this model a step further if we consider whether or not we want a change that continues to develop and adapt, in which case there should be a deliberate commitment to reevaluation and learning. So I explored a suite of tools that lended to the success of each of these steps, some to a greater degree than others. The first step, which is creating a sense of urgency, brought me to the world of public policy and administration, where practitioners seek out windows of opportunity to create change. And Josh Farley just left, but he and my advisor, Chris Kaliba, explored the idea of policy windows. It offers insight into when, why, and how change occurs, and they place an emphasis on catastrophes as catalysts or focusing events that create opportunities for new policy. And a policy window is created when 3 streams, the problem, the policy, and the politics converge. The problem stream represents the existing condition. The policy stream emerges as consensus grows around policy instruments to solve problems. And the politics stream is the national mood. That's when politicians accept the gravity of a problem and are willing to implement policies to address it. So Josh Farley and Chris Kaliba, they explored the window of opportunity for ecological economic policy following Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And they noted that the convergence of the three streams opened up an opportunity for the integration of ecological economics, but was hindered by the dominant economic paradigm, as I think we find time and again. But they noted that it could have been mediated by galvanizing public support. So there are a variety of tools that have been utilized to integrate policies dedicated to sustainability and resilience that can be utilized to create and communicate a vision and empower others to act, and build on and institutionalize change towards principles of the ecological worldview. So the first tool that I examined was indicators. I examined the use of them as tools for decision-making and policy development through the lens of sustainability. And I also explored how ecological economics could utilize indicators to propel social change towards sustainable development. Indicators, as evidenced by my research, can be instrumental, conceptual, tactical, or symbolic. And we heard a lot from Janine earlier about the nuances of indicators. But the practice of indicators involves the development of resonance in communities of interest, where indicators have the capacity to strike a chord with its intended audience. And the mechanism of developing policy resonant indicators, especially in the context of the ecological worldview, means that indicators can function as a bridge between knowledge and policy. Another way to utilize indicators, as well as move more towards that theory of change, is engaging stakeholder and public participation through adaptive governance. Indicators related to sustainability and other facets of the ecological worldview can begin to engage stakeholders through adaptive learning processes. Reed et al. Explores a variety of bottom-up methodological frameworks for developing and applying sustainability indicators at the local scale, including the Sustainable Livelihoods Analysis, which develops indicators that can monitor changes in natural, physical, social, and financial capital, and actually takes local input in developing those indicators. There's also a framework called the Natural Step, which develops indicators to represent 4 conditions for a sustainable society to identify sustainability problems and create visions and strategies. So that's great. That kind of frames an issue really well. And then in an attempt to create quick wins and really put some of these ideas on the ground, I actually turned to the world of conservation biology, where there's a new subfield of practice that draws from medicine, actually, called evidence-based conservation. And the idea is that much of current conservation work is based upon anecdote and myth rather than systemic appraisal of evidence, including experience that others have had who have tackled the same or similar problems. And due to the time-sensitive nature of many of the issues that are presented by the business as usual economic model that currently dominates mainstream rhetoric, there's a value in considering how to utilize evidence and experience to inform policy and to kind of get it going right away. And then finally, I explored the capacity of evaluative frameworks as a tool for considering how to shift programs and policy through strategic implementation and subsequent learning. And I primarily explored evaluative frameworks that consider the development of specified and general resilience of social ecological systems. And by and large, the role of these frameworks can be used to enhance understanding of adaptive co-management, assess integrated performance, and describe the need to coordinate research efforts. And evaluative frameworks allow empirical evidence grounded in practice to contribute to collective understanding of adaptive co-management. And it also permits for the articulation of argument to policymakers, NGOs, and government agencies, as well as other elements of local governance structures. So the suite of tools I examined contribute to the process outlined by John Cotter. What I sought to define in my research were tools that could be utilized in practice along the way to maintain an organized, structured vision of how we can begin to normalize and integrate the language of the ecological worldview into policies meant to increase sustainability and resilience. The notion that this work could be accepted and institutionalized in Burlington or the surrounding area seemed far more attainable when it was broken out into a series of potential processes. I found value in being able to learn from tools that have been effective in other disciplines as well as on a practice level. So I thought a lot about how we in Burlington could prepare for this, catalytic catastrophe that we all know is coming, and kind of move towards applied ecological economics by starting to have these conversations and starting to set up these tools. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was a thorough presentation. We have a question from Kate that I would say is, do you think that the worldview has to be strong enough in the populace, or have strong actors to push for the policy to be adopted and implemented? Or is there, there are other avenues to get there as well, in conjunction or in tandem?
I think that when you're talking about facilitating change on the community level, it's fairly easy to establish worldview through survey and conversation. We're able to do it so I work in transboundary water governance, and we establish value constraints within a community, and then we utilize surveys to affirm those values. And I think that it could be a similar way of affirming a more localized worldview perspective if we're talking about making change on a small scale.
Okay.
I have a question for you. Can you talk more about the evidence-based, like the conservation biology that was like based off of medicine or something? Can you just like touch more?
Yeah. So.
Summarize the question. I'm not sure everyone heard her.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry. So Eva asked me to talk a little bit more about the idea of evidence-based conservation. And I actually, I went to NYU as an undergrad, and I took a course called evidence-based conservation. One of the professors at NYU was really into the idea. But basically in medicine, in an attempt to save someone's life, rather than making sure that your plan is foolproof and well developed, you kind of just do it. And you know, it's like, what's it called? Like what's it called when you're like part of a trial? You know, you sign up for a trial.
Yeah.
So the conservation community, specifically the conservation biology community at Cambridge University, was like, everything is really fucked up on the wildlife side of things. Let's just start implementing programs, and then we'll gauge their success as they run. And ultimately, if it's a good idea, it'll have a positive result in real life, and it can also contribute to research down the line. So I think that was what I was trying to get at here, is like, why can't we, at least on a community level, start implementing some of the ideas of ecological economics and use it as a living experiment? And if we believe in the ideas that we've set forth, hopefully they'll be effective, and they'll also provide space for learning.
I'm not seeing any. I'll just jump in and say I think that's like one of the philosophies of the Next Systems project, is to sort of gather up all those local examples
For sure.
and then ask those questions about how do we scale them.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and this would kind of just be the other direction of putting those programs into place and watching them as they run.
Something not scale, but adapt to other situations.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Cool.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you, Emma. Now we're gonna move on to our final guest speaker
He's gonna do it himself.
Oh, okay.
for the conference. Brian Zech has a PhD in renewable resource, natural resource studies from the University of Arizona, with a minor in political science. He's the founding president of the Center for the Advancement of the State Economy. Brian also a visiting professor at Virginia Tech, where he teaches ecological economics in the National Capital Region. Brian is also an interdisciplinary biologist in the National Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where he received the 2010 Star Award for outstanding performance. He has a leading role in engaging the environmental sciences and natural resource professionals in ecological economics and macroeconomic policy.
Oh, do you want?
Turn that on. Turn yours off. I'll turn that on.